It's time again. Love Fridays at this time, because we get to go to film school. Dr. Joe Fortunato joins us each and every Friday morning here in the Ray Horner Morning Show. Kind enough for him to take time out of his busy week to join us here on the morning show. And now we're going back to 1980 to a super sequel. And I'll let Joe take the story from there. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Ray. Good morning, everybody. Yes, we have one of the best sequels ever, I think, in my opinion. A lot of people agree with that. And it's one of my favorite movies. I'm talking about Superman 2, the sequel to the great and one of my favorite movies, literally, Superman the movie, just a few years earlier. Superman 2, which was released in Europe in 1980, at the very end of 1980, and then wide in the U.S. in June of 1981. It was directed by Richard Lester, sort of, and this is a big story of what we have to tell. There's a lot of chaos behind the scenes of this movie. It was written by Mario Puzo, David Newman, Leslie Newman, as well as Tom Mankiewicz, who is uncredited. It was the third most popular movie in the U.S. and Canadian box office for the calendar year of 1981. It was number one for the year if you count its entire run, including pieces of 1980. This was the second sequel in history to gross over $100 million domestically after The Empire Strikes Back, which it was battling with at the same time. At the time, it was the most expensive movie ever made at its release. And Christopher Reeve felt that this is one of the best films in the franchise and one of his favorites. Now, here's where the backstory gets a little wonky. Basically, the short version of this is the director was changed midstream. And when that happens, you know, usually chaos ensues and you don't get a great movie. And this is sort of one of those where I guess the movie gods smiled down on the production and they came up with a great movie. So Richard Donner, who directed the original one, had completed about half of the film before they replaced him with Richard Lester. Both these films were being shot together, and then they were going to make, two movies out of them. So both Richard Lester and the Salkins, the producers, reached out to Richard Donner at the end of filming and offered to give him a co-directing credit on part two, but he refused. That meant that Richard Lester, there's two Richards here, had to go back and reshoot 20% of the movie because the industry union rules dictate that a director must have directed 80% of the movie to get his name listed in the credits. Are you confused yet? I hope not, but which he did end up doing. So there was a lot of reshoots, a lot of half shoots. And then later in 2006, a new version of the movie was released only on DVD and Blu-ray, and it was called Superman 2, the Richard Donner Cut, which basically reinserts all the stuff that could be salvaged from Richard Donner's original shoot and intended to put into this version, including the infamous Marlon Brando scenes that were shot that weren't used in the theatrical release. So, like I said, all that chaos in the backstory, and then that caused some riff with the crew and some of the actors and things. So by all reason, this should have been a disaster, but it turned out pretty great. But it's very, very unusual for something like that to happen, where a director gets replaced mid-film and then another one has to go and reshoot, like I said, 20% of that just to get credit with the union. So anyway, but fans of Superman and fans of Superman the movie probably know that story, but for those who are new to it, that's a pretty important part of this movie's history. Now, when the sequel was put on hold, Christopher Reeve had commitments to make a movie somewhere in time, which we'll have to do one of these days, but that's a beloved cult classic. And anyway, that overlapped with the return of making Superman 2. And he also had reservations about the new script and the way Richard Donner had been treated. So he had a little leverage at this point, and he renegotiated his contract to get a much better rate and more artistic input, which is, of course, great for him. His physique also changed significantly during the production's time. So some earlier scenes had to be shot just because his physique had changed and to match up, that continuity. John Williams did not return as the composer due to scheduling commitments he had with other films like Empire Strikes Back and Raiders of the Lost Ark. And when I mention those movies, isn't it amazing how those three great movies are all just lumped together there in the same year? What a time. Anyway, but John Williams did give permission to use his original themes, and I think the Superman theme is one of his best themes. And so they did use that along with a new score for the film.
Yeah, it was interesting, too. In the movie, there's new villains, and of course, Gene Hackman was back as the villain. I didn't realize until you opened it up right there, Joe, that Mario Puzo had a role in this movie.
Well, yeah, because he had written the original Superman in the story. And as I said, originally parts 1 and 2 were supposed to be one whole movie. And so, Mario Puzo's original draft was like 3 hours long. So he still gets story credit for Superman 2 because he created much of it.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah, some of the casting obviously was set because it's a sequel, but a little fun things. E.G. Marshall plays the president in this movie, but the front runner for that major cameo role originally was going to be Henry Fonda, which is kind of interesting because both of those guys starred in 12 Angry Men, another great movie we'll do one of these days. But Henry Fonda was almost the president. And Gene Hackman actually didn't return to do the reshoots. Remember I said that Richard Lester had to do reshoots on part of it. So all of his scenes were originally filmed by Richard Donner, and any other scenes that the new director that required Lex Luthor, they used a look-alike with a voice impersonator and added lines. So again, trouble in paradise when you talk about the production, but what a film. It's a wonderful film. Another sort of lost character, and that is the character of Eve Tessmacher. Now, that's Luthor's assistant, and she was played by Valerie Perrine. She was in Superman 2, but she kind of disappears from the storyline in the middle of the movie. And that's sort of because they didn't film new portions for her for the sequel.
Boy, this movie could have been a debacle, but it turned out being a huge success. And really, I just watched it again probably 2 or 3 weeks ago with my daughter Gia, who absolutely loves the movie. It is a really good sequel. You said it in the open. It's really well done. Surprisingly, I imagine to you, Joe, because you know all the behind problems that they had, but it came out wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're curious, check out the Richard Donner cut sometime. I'm not going to say which is better or anything because that's certainly a matter of opinion. And technically speaking, the Richard Donner cut isn't really a finished film in the professional sense, but it's an interesting kind of curiosity to look at. One more sort of quick story, in the behind-the-scenes story. I talked about Tom Mankiewicz did writing for this film, but he didn't get screen credit. Well, he actually wrote some James Bond movies, and one of the characters in this movie is a sheriff, and the sheriff played by Clifton James in Superman 2 is very likely the same sheriff from Live and Let Die, which Tom Mankiewicz wrote. So a little connection there between James Bond and Superman.
Superman 2, going to film school with Dr. Joe Fortunato today on Film School on WAKR. Pull that one out this weekend. All right, Joe, let's go to you. What do you got going on?
Well, I don't have anything new coming up soon, but we had a great time last week with Adult Guardianship Services, and they did Fortunato Film School with Raiders of the Lost Ark, so I want to thank them for a wonderful time. Everybody there had a great time. We had a beautiful theater room to screen the film by the Courtyard by Marriott, and that was a great time, and I hope we get to do that again. Of course, you can always go to my website, joefortunato.net, to see the latest and greatest things that are coming up on my schedule. You can also go back and listen to old shows of us and other things that I've done in the media, and it's just a repository of cool stuff. joefortunato.net. Check it out.
He has his hands on the movie industry. That is for sure. Joe, as always, my friend, I know you're busy. Thanks for carving out some minutes with us on Friday morning. Always look forward to it, and we'll do it again next week. Thank you, my friend.
All right. Look forward to it. See you then.
All right. Dr. Joe Fortunato, Film School with us here on the morning show. 93.5, 1590 WAKR.